This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. Snorri cackled and sucked at his teeth. The wind blasted across the lake, cutting the snow into sharp ridges. He hurled instructions at me as if he were whipping a husky, and I spun the wheel according to Snorri's command. Our tyres rolled off the beach onto the thick ice cap that froze over the lake in winter, clods of snow drumming the floorboard from underneath, like the rapping of the dead. Somewhere in the endless white lay our destination. "I'm a records clerk," I said. "A noble profession. I shelve file folders and fuss with index cards. I'm not trained as a crime scene technician." "I'll bet the constable doesn't get out of his vehicle," Snorri laughed, no longer having to be discreet. Despite having left the force more than a year before, he came around the station house to harvest gossip and otherwise pierce the tedium of his days. Today, he'd come to us with the news. With a grunt of satisfaction, Snorri shot an index finger under my nose. "Over there." 3 precinct cars tailed us in caravan style. A procession blind to its destination and deaf to the admonishing wind. A knot of veins flared between Snorri's eyes. We had found the hillock of snow Snorri wanted. It was the sole hillock of snow on the frozen lake, and he'd scraped it up himself, a beer to mark the spot. His face twisted with exhilaration. The remaining vehicles slid into place, a brake against the gusts. Engines were cut, with more boots hitting the ice. Flipping the door handles, we stepped out and gathered in a ring. I looked around, first at Snorri and then at Bergthora, the sole remaining sergeant detective in our precinct. She was a wary creature whose penchant for vigilance had by slow degrees surrendered to grievance, just as her husky frame had given over to butter. The circle was completed by Patrolman Yerka, whose crisp azure uniform seemed ridiculously cheery. Snorri muttered, "You see, what I said is true." Yes, we finally saw what we had come to see. I gazed down at the exploding nova of hair through the window of ice at our feet. The girl seemed to float in a cauldron of glass. She'd been there for a while, days at least. Her eyes rolled back, her arms spread in pirouette beneath the translucent dome. A distorted shadow in the watery darkness. "Always a female," said Bergthora. "I'm a musician. I work as a records clerk at the police station for the paycheck. Fuglaflugahall is a modest harbour city on Lake Munch that insists on its image as a dour commercial town, a solemnity underwritten by the beautiful dark secret of Scandinavian contentment. The unwritten code: conform, conform. Do not stick out. Do not be different. Do not behave as if you have something unusual about you. The day job suits me. By nature, I'm an observer, a listener, absorbing all. When I'm not toting sheaves of paper for cases or denying access to miscreants, I work on my music. At night, keyboards, band rehearsal. During the day, I get my musical fix while doing something else. I might give the impression of being unusually fidgety, but what I'm really doing is ensuring I understand. I work on a tricky spot in a song and run my hands over an imaginary keyboard as fast as I can, on the dashboard, on a lintel, on my thigh, insanely fast, hammering every single note. If I can do that, I'll completely own the sound later." Snorri picked at his eyebrows and applied his blunt intellect like a pair of industrial tongs. "Lots of people walk out on this ice, hiking or skiing or chasing a pet or drunk. Once every few years, some poor idiot breaks through." The little man's eyes flitted over the rim of the frozen grave. After a considerable pause, he remarked, "But this girl, she didn't just break through." A perfunctory whoop echoed through the group, our signal for agreement. Snorri continued examining the scene as if he was parting the bones of a herring. He noted the thinness of the ice trapping her, and that the surrounding ice was clear, with stress fractures that shot through the surface like the tails of comets. The surrounding sheet was the kind that takes months for nature to build, yet the mirror-smooth surface directly over her was less than a few centimeters thick. The new ice was recent and terribly precise. Snorri tapped his nose. Made for the purpose. Yerka nodded tentatively. I know what to call it. A lid. Snorri beamed. Exactly, it's a lid. Flushed with overconfidence, however, he pushed his logic too far, supposing this or that, extrapolating any tenuous connection, nattering on and excluding only what his spirit impelled him to exclude. Finally, he arrived at a Zen-like impossibility. Someone had welded the ice cap in place. Welded? Bergthora snorted. Welded, Snorri insisted. Yerka said, I've heard of carving ice, but not welding ice. Bergthora rolled her eyes at the circus. Welded with what? A culinary torch. Bergthora wheeled on Snorri, a wave of flesh rolling across her gut. This isn't wagering on a Sunday match. You're beyond your depths, Sturluson. I've been known to beat the odds. What are you even doing here? You were forced to retire. Snorri's squint at me was as bitter as the one I received from him the morning the file had landed on the desk of the Director General for Internal Affairs. Everything was fine for 45 years until someone toted the wrong file from the archives. Bergthora interrupted him. Back in the car, Sturluson. Snorri planted his heels and said, I found the body. Bergthora hitched her thumbs into her belt. A standoff. Yerka used the backs of his trouser calves to polish his boots. I studied the lace of fractures in the ice. Meanwhile, Bergthora tugged a thread on her sleeve and hinted she might lodge a complaint with the Justice Ministry. Recalcitrants hung heavy on the moment. Snorri spat at a snowbank. With our alternatives rapidly diminishing, the rest of us turned practical. We documented, made shaky videos, tapped notes into our electronic devices. Yerka took countless photos with great care and paced off the perimeter distance. Bergthora broke the stalemate to produce a thermos of black coffee, dispensing it in paper cups. Having otherwise wordlessly dispatched of our duties, we gathered again around the dead girl. Snorri said we needed a way to extract the body. Bergthora declared a chainsaw the best tool. A rectangular swath would be cut around the corpse, a process she'd read about in an article on corpse recovery. Or was it a circular swath? She couldn't remember. While she thought about it, she ordered Yerka to fetch equipment from the vehicles. Yerka trudged off, shoulders sinking. Hefting surely was the lowest job on an investigation. I was surprised Bergthora had not assigned it to me. Grumbling with discontent, Bergthora then began to second-guess her own decision. She muttered that a chainsaw would disturb evidence, and, even so, a rookie knew that the cut should be rectangular. Snorri countered with a long discredited theory that the body could remain as it was until the spring thaw. Bergthora retorted that vinyl fishnets were superior in every way for retrieving corpses from water. Dogmas mounted, spread, ossified. Yerka returned empty-handed. Fine preparations here. The car boots are empty. No chainsaw or any other equipment to fetch a body from the lake. Bergthora smiled sharply. Her all-purpose pessimism was vindicated. Snorri and Yerka debated who should go back to the Fuglaflugahall station. The dispute led to accusations. Meanwhile, the wind whipped the snow into miniature whirlwinds that blasted themselves back into powder against the car doors. We huddled and quarrelled, oblivious to the nightmare beneath our feet. As predicted, the constable had remained in his car, engine cut, sheltered from the wind while consulting his ancient manual on investigative science. I'd seen the book open on his desk. It was almost a century old, filled with dense, hand-wrought diagrams and complex tables, and with guidance surely obsolete. I'd seen the constable around the precinct, but didn't know him well. His inky wool suit, cuff-linked shirts, cravats and wingtips, the heavy cloak and ever-present manual were relics of long-gone salad days and fodder for pub-hour mockery. The constable stepped from his car onto the lake. one exploratory foot after the other. He wore heavy-rimmed glasses. The left lens blackened to disguise an old wound that had taken his sight in that eye. At some angles, the black disc seemed to absorb all light falling upon it. At others, it glinted like a scythe of obsidian. I didn't know the constable, but he knew me. He marched straight toward me. "You a coal-bitter?" It had been the constable himself who had insisted I accompany the squad. I was baffled when I saw the request, and though I dared not confess it for fear of insolence, I had better things to do with my life than play at cops and robbers. "Yes," I said. "Yerka informed me they found no tools. You loaded the vehicles?" "You mean today?" He cut me off. Wiry grey hair jutted in sprigs around his ears. I slipped my hands into my parka, wary. My fingers worked at a song. "Check the glove box of your vehicle for the aerosol snow wax, coal-bitter." I fetched the can. Bending and marking the icy grave with wax and X's and zeros, the constable hunched over his work as a shaman at his cymbals. He seemed to detect things the rest of us could not, as he crouched in the wind, cloak fluttering. "It's too stupid, terrible, hopeless." His lips paled with pressure. Then the constable stooped and lifted something from the ice. He handed me a shaggy brown clot of hair. "Human hair?" I asked. "No," he blasted back. "Can you not tell human hair from animal hair, boy?" I glanced at Snorri, then back at the constable. "I'm just a records clerk, sir." The constable went back to spraying, wandering the ribs of the shoreline, an ever-lengthening trail of forensic wax dropping like spore along his path. I looked back down on the frozen cloud of hair about the victim, bewildered, inexplicably embarrassed, listening to the crepitating ice. Snorri shattered the moment with a plea. "Constable, the sun is well past overhead. Our shift is almost over." Bergthora laughed with a sputter. "You don't have a shift, Sturluson. You don't work anymore." The clouds had dropped and thickened. The sun was lost in grey. I did not want to be there. My heart was elsewhere. I dug my gloves further into the trenches of my parka and began again to finger an unheard chord. My head bobbed with the chord transition, a vexing shift I'd been labouring over. As my glove bumped into something hidden, a mechanical rumble started somewhere nearby. But I dismissed the noise as being incidental. I might have seen puffs of smoke wafting toward shore and misconstrued them as the handiwork of my racked imagination, a prefiguration of dry ice fog and lasers in a roaring stadium. The constable had loped almost a kilometre away to pursue something unknown to us, a detail, a pattern. Snorri drew a hand over the spade of his beard. Our quarrel resumed within no time. Ours were the uncompromising disputes of those who treat delay as an entitlement and guesswork as science. At the Fula Flugahall precinct, few things were as deeply satisfying as a procedural victory. The sun sank toward the hills. An hour later, everything had been posited, nothing resolved. We had lost sight of the constable. The wind moaned, the heavens darkened, and time disappeared like a continental shelf into the sea. Then we saw the constable's flagging greatcoat and heard his cries across the frozen lake. He sprinted toward us over the ice, legs pumping. He had a long way to go, a kilometre perhaps, as we watched him tip and right in mad measures, waving his hands overhead. His screams seemed to perish on the wind like the cannonade of a losing army. "What's he saying?" Snorri fingered the skinflakes beneath his beard. "What do you think, Grammaticus? You're a young man, and you have good ears." I leaned toward the constable's shouts. After much consideration, I said, "I don't know." I sensed a tide of resentment in the silence of those around me. I shrugged. "I'm only a records clerk." As it turned out, my shrug inspired their mutual incomprehension. They all shrugged too. None of us could decipher the constable's caterwauling. Slowly, the bounding man's cries collapsed into meaning. "Turn it up!" Too late. An enormous snap thundered a dozen yards behind us. We pivoted as smoothly as the chorus in a Wagnerian opera. gawking as a precinct wagon lurched. The rear axle spasmed, the front bumper yawned at the sky. Steam shot from beneath the vehicle, the frame shuddered, a fissure opened, and the wagon slipped through the ice into the boiling deep. Rafts of ice closed over the water, that is, over the wagon I'd driven with Snorri beside me gabbling directions. My gloved left hand wormed deep into the folds of my coat pocket, hunting. And there it was, an electronic ignition key that could start a car from a dozen meters. A vehicle that, with a running engine, would melt the ice underneath. The constable reached us, huffing. He halted, toes digging like crampons into the snow, his one good eye fixed on the bubbling gap in the ice. Tremors of outrage propagated over his face. "Coal bitter?" I quailed. "Sir?" There I stood before them all, helpless. A tide of blood throbbed in my ears. My hand stopped twitching. I freed the key from my pocket and dangled the fob before them. The constable plied the scar beside his eye patch. Jerker kneaded the back of his neck, and Bergthora frowned grimly. Snorri sat on the snow, placing his head in his hands. "Ugh," Snorri moaned. Pellets of snow streaked from the demolished sky. A pale tangle lay beside the hole the girl had been sunk in. It then dawned on me that the pale tangle was the girl. Her body lay sprawled on top of the ice, displaced by the minor tsunami of the sinking car and ejected from the ice like the cork from a champagne bottle. Her clothes spread about her in wet snarls lurid under the dim sun, a cape and corset and stockings. The girl's pallor was blue and ruinous. My jaw slackened. I tried to utter some words, any words, whether of shock, wisdom, or warning. No sound emanated from my lips, for a pair of large wings had begun unfolding around the corpse, beautiful, wispy, shivering with each gust like the pin feathers of a hatchling drying in the dying light.
That was The Berserkers, written by Vic Peterson and read by Tom Newton. It's the first chapter of the novel The Berserkers from Hawkwood Books, 2022. Hello, Vic, and welcome to The Strange Recital.
Hi, Britt and Tom. I am delighted to be on The Strange Recital.
And we're happy to have you here. So first, tell us a bit about the Berserkers, a brief synopsis.
The Berserkers is a very strange book. It's a mashup of genres, and it won't be to everyone's taste, but my goal at this point is to be a cult author. And so I think I've started off on the right foot. The hero in the Berserkers, Grammaticus Colbitter, leads a double life. He is a police precinct records clerk by day and a keyboardist in a heavy metal band by night. When a woman from the fictional Nordic town of Fullaflugahall, where Grammaticus is from, is found stabbed in a nearby lake, dressed only in a corset and wings of a Norse Valkyrie, Grammaticus is reluctantly pulled into the investigation. In the Berserkers, I've tried to blend dark humor, heavy metal, magic, and murder. So the eccentric log lady from the TV show Twin Peaks would fit right in with this crowd.
Well, we just heard the first chapter of the book, and from this, one might think the Berserkers fits nicely into that new popular genre called Scandi noir or Nordic noir. But reading the novel, you find it's not that at all. It becomes some sort of gothic comic book or even Viking sword and sorcery in a modern industrial landscape. complete with heavy metal soundtrack. So I like this kind of genre busting, defiance of marketing pigeonholes. Can you tell us how the book developed in this way?
A Gothic comic book makes me feel good. Like the readers had the kind of experience I was hoping for. The book began as a private joke. Several people I knew were reading Henning Mankell, and I started riffing on the sound of the Scandinavian names with ridiculous wordplay, a sort of overeducated version of the Muppets' Swedish Chef. I'd been wanting to write a novel for a while, and at a certain point I decided to take the leap with this stuff. I had the crime element from Mankell, I had the Swedish Chef, and so naturally I went to the ancient Scandinavian sagas for deep background on the book. The sagas are medieval stories that drew on Old Norse mythology. The sagas run the gamut from realistic travel chronicles to a sort of original sword and sorcery. And they can be hilariously funny, or some of them need trigger warnings for violence and adult content. And so it occurred to me that I could write this modern story as a mashup and sort of partake in the spirit of the Norse sagas. The Viking heavy metal component entered because I wanted to give my hero a more distinctive personality to up the stakes. As luck would have it, there was a concert in my little town in Kansas with bands from Germany and Finland, hardcore metal bands, advertising themselves as purveyors of Gothic and Viking metal. I couldn't pass that up. Lots of sword and sorcery stuff there, and I walked out essentially with a unique identity for my hero. It was a nice aha moment.
This is a murder mystery.
But it's also a comedy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a murder mystery and comedy in which you take advantage of the opportunity to poke fun at the police. The important detective work is done by a trio: a lowly records clerk, an outcast ex-cop, and an unusual young woman whose description might take too long for right now. Why did you make the choice to put the solution in their hands?
I thought it would make people laugh. I'm a comedian at heart. This is a trio of underdogs. It's easy to get them into trouble. And these underdogs are geeks and outcasts. That would speak to likely readers of this book, I thought.
An important character in the book is that ex-cop, Snorri Sturluson, which I learned with a little research is the name of a historical figure. Tell us about that.
Snorri's name came to me because I thought that was funny too. Snorri sounds to a speaker of English like snore, which makes him sound sleepy. Now, the historical Snorri Sturluson was not a sleepy guy. He was the great scribe of the Norse sagas. He lived in Iceland when Christianity was sweeping through the Norse countries. The Old Norse had produced virtually no written literature until that time. What Snorri Sturluson wrote down gives us almost all we know of Thor and Loki and Freya and that whole pantheon. I thought that juxtaposition was fun. My Snorri versus the historical Snorri. Plus, I believe a good book ought to have multiple layers of meaning.
Yes, multiple layers is good.
The more you scratch, the more that's revealed.
Oh, yeah.
True. And then there's the constable, a character that doesn't quite fit any policeman mold we've seen before. He's a mysterious figure, a dark magician of sorts. What was your inspiration for him?
I build things slowly over time, and a lot depends on what I read.
Mm-hmm.
A conventional detective is cranky or eccentric. Think of Sherlock Holmes or Columbo.
Mm-hmm.
My first level of inspiration for the constable came actually from reading Christopher Isherwood's novel about his time as a scriptwriter in Hollywood, Prater Violet. I was fascinated by the character of the pushy director, so I used him as a model. I also encountered advice from a conventional mystery novelist that it's a good idea to give a detective a distinctive physical feature for memorability. Poirot's mustache, Ironsides in a wheelchair, that sort of thing.
Okay.
At first, the eye patch was just a trick. Then I realized Speaking of the sagas, Odin is blind in one eye. Hence the dark wizard stuff. In the sagas, Odin's personality is pushy, elusive, and self-indulgent. And unlike Gandalf, he's not a very likable character. And I tried to mirror that in The Constable.
And let's not forget the two ravens, whose names mean memory and thought. Memory, in particular, is of major assistance in solving the mystery. But what is memory, really?
And for that matter, what is thought?
What are memory and thought? Gosh, I've forgotten.
Yeah, it's not easy.
My ravens are variants of the ravens accompanying Odin. They are familiars, they're factotums, and ways for me to blend themes in the book. I used them to slip in the connotations you picked up about thought and memory and how together those two things can aid in solving puzzles, possibly existential puzzles.
Do you play in a Viking heavy metal band? Or have you ever been a Scandinavian cop?
Sadly, neither one.
Well, as far as I can tell, you're an American. I have to think you must have family ties to Scandinavia. It's a bold move to set a novel in a foreign country. It presents a variety of challenges. Why did you decide to do that?
I'm an American with a little Swedish background, but nothing that I hold out is important. I don't speak any of the languages. I've been to Stockholm once for 2 days, and I had about 3 weeks in Iceland as a tourist, and that's it. The country where the Berserkers is set is never named, and the town where the murder occurs, Fullaflugahall, is a complete fabrication. It's a conglomeration of all Nordic regions churned through the imagination of a guy from Kansas. Stepping away from the limitations of a specific country was very liberating. And somewhere along the way, I realized the writing about another place and culture must be like writing science fiction. You don't have to have spent time in the place, but you do have to believe this place can exist and populate it with vivid details that make others believe.
Yeah.
I think a lot about stage designers in the theater when I'm writing these sorts of things. You don't need a whole mansion on stage, just a compelling facade.
When I learned that you live at least part of the time in Lawrence, Kansas, my first thought was, the madness of William S. Burroughs. Any influence there, or who would you cite as your influences?
William S. Burroughs. This is heresy to say in Lawrence, Kansas, but I'm not a fan.
Yeah, well, I'm not a fan either.
His subjects were breakthrough, and there are some exquisite lyrical passages in Junkie and a few other places. But in terms of his style, he's too aggressively fragmentary for me. I'll take a rain check on Naked Lunch. Who are my influences? I suppose it comes down to books that have shaped me. The Lord of the Rings. Maybe that's obvious. John Gardner's Freddy's book and Grendel. Virginia Woolf's Orlando.
Oh, yeah.
George Orwell, both his masterpieces, 1984 and Animal Farm. And Susan Sontag and Salman Rushdie are my go-to moral touchstones. Lastly, there is a wonderful video on the internet of Kurt Vonnegut describing the shape of stories. That lecture is awesome.
Yes, I've seen that video.
The Berserkers is your debut novel, and it just came out this past April. Are you working on anything new?
I am not letting the grass grow under my feet. I have a novel, which is a series of linked novellas, and each has a different protagonist who encounters the same magical book in a different place, different era, with different outcomes. The magical book is a kind of avatar of hope, I think.
Good. Well, thanks, Vic. It's been very nice talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to introduce the Berserkers to more people.
Thanks, Vic.
You know, the Berserkers of legend were interesting. Crazed warriors who fought in a wild, bloodthirsty trance, out of control.
I heard that Flyer Garrick might have had something to do with the craziness of Berserkers. Or maybe not. But either way, I have some here. I found it in the garden. Want to give it a shot?
Ah, perfect for a Tuesday afternoon. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Small Beer, with lyrics by Vic Peterson directly from his novel The Berserkers, produced by Vic's friends at Coneflower Consulting. This is episode 22121. Fly agaric. I've heard it was the origin of our seasonal hallucination of a fat little man in a red and white suit. What do you think?